Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is Dr. Thomas Coyle, and in this lecture, I'm going to be discussing various issues related to gender, focusing on aspects of gender role development, which is the development of understanding gender and understanding, as I'll mention in a moment, that sex, biological sex, is a stable attribute that doesn't change over the course of development. So I'll talk about both of those things, focusing on three theories of gender role development, which I'll mention briefly now and then discuss in a moment. The theories are cognitive developmental theory, which focuses on gender constancy. You can see that on this overhead. As well as two others, and the two others are learning theory, which focuses on the role of reinforcement and punishment in shaping expectations about gender, and then finally gender schema theory, a final theory, which focuses on gender schemas, which are beliefs and expectations about gender that can affect memories, and whether memories are accurate or inaccurate, and I'll elaborate on that later. All right, so without further ado, we're going to be talking about gender with a focus on gender role development. Now, gender role development refers to the development of beliefs and expectations about gender and the understanding that gender, biological sex in particular, is a stable attribute that remains constant over development. And research on gender role development is generally focused on two concepts: gender constancy and knowledge of sex-type behavior. Gender constancy, I mentioned these in a moment ago in discussing gender role development. Gender constancy refers to the understanding that gender is a stable attribute. Gender here is biological sex, is a stable attribute that remains constant over time, and that doesn't change over time, even if an individual's appearance changes. And a variety of tests have been used in developmental psychology with kids to examine gender constancy. One is informally called the man in a dress test, where young children view a man putting on a dress and are asked before the man puts on the dress and then after the man puts on the dress, questions about the man's sex and whether the man remains a man when the dress is on compared to when the dress was off. And kids who understand gender constancy understand that the man's sex remains the same when the dress is put on, despite the changes in the appearance. But this understanding is not present initially in development, in early development, in early childhood, but emerges over time. And I'll go through the stages during which it emerges in just a moment when I talk about cognitive developmental theory. Gender role development research also focuses on knowledge of sex-type behavior. Sex-type behaviors simply refer to behaviors that society considers to be appropriate for males and females, men and women, boys and girls. These behaviors are based on expectations about how men and women should behave, and therefore are effectively stereotypes. Stereotypes are nothing more than beliefs or expectations about how people should behave. And in some cases, stereotypes can lead to various sorts of problems because they can constrain the types of behaviors that people feel comfortable displaying. But these expectations can shape our behaviors and can shape how we view other people as well. And research on gender role development seeks to understand how people develop this knowledge of sex-type behaviors and whether it affects their own behavior in certain ways, whether it affects how they interact, for example, how a young child interacts, for example, with different types of toys that are masculine or feminine. I'll talk about a study that addresses just that issue in a moment. So that's some background about gender role development and the two primary constructs that research on gender role development focuses on, again, gender constancy and knowledge of sex type behaviors. What I want to do now is turn to the theories of gender role development that attempt to explain certain aspects of gender role development, beginning with a discussion of cognitive developmental theory, the one you can see on the overhead, which focuses on gender constancy. Remember, gender constancy refers to the understanding that an individual's sex is a stable attribute that doesn't change over development, even if the appearance of the individual may change, as it does in the man in the dress test scenario. And cognitive developmental theory has described 3 stages through which individuals go before fully understanding gender constancy. And the 3 stages are gender identity, gender stability, and of course gender constancy, which you can see on the overhead, and which include the ages in which kids generally come to understand certain aspects of gender from the earliest to the latest. So let's talk about each of the stages, beginning with gender identity, which is the earliest stages and which is present around 3 years of age. In this stage, this is the very first stage in cognitive developmental theory of gender constancy. And in this stage of gender identity, young kids are simply able to identify themselves as a boy or a girl. That is, they're able to identify their sex. However, they are not yet able to pass, that is, to perform accurately on the man in the dress test scenario. So if kids in the stage of gender identity are presented with a man wearing a dress and are asked whether the man is a man or a woman, they often say the man is a woman, even if they had just seen the man without the dress and subsequently seen the man put on the dress. It seems like these kids are fooled by appearances and don't realize or fully understand gender constancy. But they are able to repeat, they are able to identify themselves accurately as a boy or a girl. That is, they're able to identify themselves as male or female, which is a prerequisite to understanding gender constancy, but a necessary but not sufficient characteristic to understanding gender constancy, if you will. So that's the first stage. The second stage in cognitive developmental theory is gender stability, which is present around 4 years of age. And in this stage, kids acquire an understanding that sex is a stable attribute of an individual that remains constant over time. That is, they understand effectively that little boys grow up to be men and little girls grow up to be women, which is an advance over the previous stage where individuals in gender identity did not possess this type of understanding, but merely were able to identify themselves as a boy or a girl. Despite that, however, kids in gender stability still don't have an understanding of gender constancy because they still continue to fail the so-called man in the dress test. They're still fooled by appearances and believe a man who puts on a dress has become a woman even when they have seen the man without the dress just prior to him putting it on. This changes, however, in the third and final stage of cognitive developmental theory, appropriately labeled gender constancy, which occurs around 5 years of age. And in this stage, kids have a full understanding of gender constancy and now understand that gender is stable attribute that remains constant over time, and understand that the attribute, the sex of a person, continues to persist even when they change their appearance. So that is, kids in this stage can now pass the man in the dress test. This should remind you, it occurs to me, this should remind you of something we discussed earlier called qualitative identity, which refers to the understanding that the identity of a particular animal remains constant, even if its appearance changes. I talked about this in the context of the Maynard the cat study, where Maynard the cat, a cat, had a mask, a dog mask put on its face. And then young kids, were asked whether Maynard remained a cat or had become a dog. And you might recall the young kids, the 3-year-old pre-operational kids, often responded incorrectly and said that Maynard the cat was in fact a dog. They believed Maynard had become a dog, despite the fact that they had just seen Maynard the cat without the dog mask, and therefore should have known that the cat's identity had not changed. Okay. So those are the stages of gender constancy in cognitive developmental theory. I guess the main point here, at least one of the main points, is a full understanding of gender constancy does not occur until around 5 years of age, after which kids have gone through the 2 previous stages of gender identity and stability. Okay. So that's the first theory of gender role development. But there are other theories as well, and I'd like to talk about a second theory of gender and gender role development called learning theory, which focuses on sex-type behaviors. You might recall that sex-type behaviors are behaviors that society considers appropriate for a man or a woman, boy or girl, or more generally males and females. And these sex-type behaviors are based, again, on expectations, which may be incorrect about what men and women can do and should do, and therefore these expectations are based on stereotypes, which are in fact beliefs and expectations about an individual or a group of individuals, in this case, can oftentimes lead to discrimination and lead to bad outcomes, but they persist nonetheless in people's heads, and they can shape people's behaviors, and they can also shape how people view each other. So learning theory focuses on these sex-type behaviors, again, behaviors that society considers to be appropriate for men and women. And it makes a few key assumptions. I suppose the most important assumption is that sex-type behaviors, according to learning theory, sex-type behaviors are shaped by reinforcement and punishment. Those are the 2 primary mechanisms of change in learning theory that affect sex-type behaviors. The basic predictions are that parents in early development, parents reinforce sex-type behaviors in kids. That is, they reward kids, if you will, for behaving in accordance with sex-type behaviors or consistent with what society expects in boys and girls. And in contrast, the theory predicts that parents punish cross-sex behaviors in kids. Cross-sex behaviors are behaviors that are inconsistent with sex-type behaviors and are behaviors that are exhibited by the opposite sex. So a cross-sex behavior might include a boy behaving in a way that would be more appropriate for a girl, or conversely a girl behaving in a way that would be more appropriate for a boy. Okay. And the theory generally predicts that parents are going to punish those behaviors. Remember, punishment simply refers to consequences that are designed to reduce the likelihood of a behavior. So punishment in this particular case might refer to a parent telling a child not to exhibit or to continue to exhibit a cross-sex behavior. And the key question, as always, is whether the assumptions of a theory, whether the predictions of a theory are in fact accurate. The only way you know for sure is to go out and do a study. And so with that in mind, I'd like to turn to a classic study by Langlois and Downs that involved 2-year-old kids. The purpose of the study was to examine the assumptions of learning theory. The two key assumptions were first, that parents would reinforce sex-type behaviors, effectively reward sex-type behaviors, praise children, if you will, for acting in a way that was consistent with their gender. And the second assumption that was tested was that parents would punish kids who exhibited cross-sex behaviors or who exhibited behaviors that were not consistent with sex-type behaviors and who were effectively behaving in a way that was typical of the opposite sex, as when, for example, a boy might be behaving in a way that was considered appropriate for a girl, or a girl behaving in a way considered appropriate for a boy. Okay, so that was the purpose, to test the assumptions of learning theory. How did they do it? This brings me to procedure. So in the study, the 2-year-old kids were brought into a laboratory playroom with their parents. And 2 types of toys were made available for the kids to play with. The kids were 2-year-old boys and girls. And the two types of toys were masculine toys and feminine toys. They were given those labels. Masculine toys referred to toys that were considered appropriate for boys based on an earlier survey that was given to parents about which toys would be appropriate for boys and girls. And the masculine toys included things like a G.I. Joe doll and a Tonka truck. And these were things, again, that parents had previously rated as being appropriate for boys based on stereotypes. In addition to the masculine toys, there were also feminine toys that were available. And the feminine toys included Barbie dolls and a kitchen set to cook with or bake with. And again, these feminine toys were rated as being feminine by adults in a separate analysis prior to the study. Okay, and these were the 2 types of toys that were made available to the kids in the playroom with their parents present, watching them. And the key issue, or the key question in the study, was how parents would react to their kids playing with these 2 types of toys, and how they would react to kids when they showed sex-type behaviors, which would occur when boys played with masculine toys and girls with feminine toys, and how they would react when the kids showed cross-sex behaviors, which would occur when the boys played with feminine toys and the girls with masculine toys, and whether these reactions would be consistent with the assumptions of learning theory. And the findings indicated, by the way, that parents did react in a way that was consistent with the assumptions of learning theory. In particular, parents, both mothers and fathers, tended to reward, that is, reinforce sex-type behaviors, where they reinforced kids who are showing behaviors considered appropriate for their gender, boys playing with G.I. Joe dolls and Tonka trucks, and girls playing with Barbie dolls and kitchenware sets. In contrast, the parents consistently punished kids for showing cross-sex behaviors, where boys might play with Barbie dolls and kitchenware sets, and girls with G.I. Joe dolls and Tonka trucks, which would be playing with toys that were deemed appropriate for the opposite gender. So parents behaved in accordance with the predictions of learning theory, reinforcing, again, sex-type behaviors and punishing cross-sex behaviors. Punishing here simply means that parents typically dissuaded their kids from playing with toys regarded as being appropriate for the opposite sex. Okay, and that could include sort of a verbal command not to play with the toy, but to play with another toy that was considered appropriate for his or her sex. Okay, so the findings were consistent with the general predictions of learning theory, and suggest, by the way, that kids develop sex-type behaviors, at least in part, because parents reinforce them and punish cross-sex behaviors. A couple of related issues that I wanted to mention briefly before moving on, which focus on punishment of cross-sex behaviors. Cross-sex behaviors, remember, refer to behaviors considered appropriate for the opposite sex, which would occur when a boy, for example, was playing with a Barbie doll or a kitchenware set in the previous study, and when a girl was playing with a G.I. Joe or Tonka truck, again, in the previous study. So first, boys and girls. As it turns out, boys and girls are punished at different rates for cross-sex behaviors. In general, what you find is that boys are punished more frequently and more severely for cross-sex behaviors, whereas girls are typically punished less frequently and less severely for cross-sex behaviors. Okay. In other words, another way of looking at it is the gender boundaries, if you will, for gendered behaviors are more fluid or porous for girls and are more rigid for boys. Mothers and fathers also show differences, and how frequently they punish cross-sex behaviors. As it turns out, fathers are more likely to punish cross-sex behaviors, to tell the child to stop displaying cross-sex behaviors, whereas mothers are less likely to punish cross-sex behaviors, less likely than fathers, anyways, to tell kids to stop showing evidence of cross-sex behaviors. I guess the point of research showing this is that fathers tend to be more likely to enforce gendered behaviors, punishing cross-sex behaviors, whereas mothers are less likely to enforce gender stereotypes. When I say gender behaviors, I mean gender stereotypes, less frequently punishing kids for cross-sex behaviors. Okay. Finally, the third theory I'd like to discuss is gender schema theory, a theory that naturally focuses on its namesake, gender schemas. Gender schemas, as I mentioned before, are simply beliefs and expectations about the roles of men and women, boys and girls, males and females more generally, that are deemed appropriate by society. These beliefs and expectations are stereotypes. Stereotypes are beliefs and expectations about individuals and groups of people that may or may not be accurate, and oftentimes are not accurate, but are nonetheless stored in our memories, in long-term memory, and can, in principle, affect our outlook about different people and different groups of people. A lot of research has focused on schemas in memory, particular schemas and memory in young kids, kids around 5 or 6 years of age or younger, with a key issue being whether the schemas influence memory and lead to accurate or inaccurate memories of events that young kids are witnessing. And what's generally found in these studies is that memories are relatively accurate, memories of experiences that have been witnessed in the past are relatively accurate when the experiences are consistent with gender schemas, that is, consistent with beliefs and expectations. But in contrast, memories are relatively inaccurate for experiences that are inconsistent with gender schemas, or that to some extent violate the gender schemas, at least for very young kids or youngish kids, 5 and 6-year-olds. In a classic study that examined the link between gender schemas and memories and the accuracy of memories was conducted by Martin and Halverson and involved 5 and 6-year-old kids. So the key purpose of the study was to test the link between gender schemas and memories by showing kids a video of a man and a woman playing different roles, and then asking them some questions later on about what happened in the video and evaluating whether their memories for what happened were accurate or inaccurate. So there were 2 phases in the study. I've labeled them phase 1 and phase 2 appropriately. In the first phase, the kids were shown a video of a man and woman playing different roles. And there were 2 conditions which played 2 different videos to the kids. In the sex-type video condition, that was the first condition, the kids saw a video of a man playing the role of a doctor and a woman playing the role of a nurse, which was deemed at the time to be consistent with gender schemas. This study was done some decades ago, and it's not clear to me whether the results will be replicated today because the gender schemas may have changed, but several decades ago there were many more men playing the roles of doctors, hospitals and whatnot, than there are today. But that's what happened in the sex-type video condition. The kids saw a sex-type video with a man playing the role of a doctor and a woman playing the role of a nurse, which was consistent with gender schemas, according to Martin and Halverson. The other condition was the atypical roles condition, and a separate group of kids were assigned to this condition and saw this video. And as the name implies here, the kids in the atypical roles condition saw a different video with the roles of the man and women reversed compared to the first one. So in the atypical roles video, the kids saw a man playing the role of a nurse and a woman playing the role of a doctor, which was the opposite of what the kids in the sex-type video had seen. And the question was whether kids would be able to accurately remember what they had seen in these 2 videos later on. And this brings me to phase 2, which occurred 1 week later when kids returned to the laboratory environment to have their memories tested for what they had seen 1 week prior. And the key question was whether the accuracies of the memories would differ in the 2 conditions, and they did. So in general, accuracy was relatively high in the sex-typed video condition, where kids 1 week prior saw a man playing the role of a doctor and a woman the role of a nurse, and remembered 1 week later in phase 2 the roles correctly, meaning they remembered a man playing the role of a doctor and a woman the role of a nurse. In contrast to the findings for the sex type condition in phase 2, memories were relatively inaccurate in the atypical roles video condition in phase 2 1 week later. In particular, in the atypical roles condition in phase 2 1 week later, kids often also reported having seen a man playing the role of a doctor and a woman playing the role of a nurse, even though they had seen 1 week prior the exact opposite in the video. That is, apparently the kids in the atypical roles condition had distorted their memories over the course of 1 week, or were distorting their memories to be consistent with the gender schemas, but were inconsistent with what they had actually seen. So the point of the study in general is that, at least for young kids, remember these are 5 and 6 year olds, memories are shaped, at least in part, by beliefs and expectations in memory and long-term memory, which can shape the accuracies of our memories later on and influence whether we recall something correctly at a later point in time or incorrectly at a later point in time. The general assumption is that memories will be relatively accurate for young kids, for 5 and 6 year old kids, if they're recalling something at a later point in time that is consistent with their gender schemas, whereas the 5 and 6 year olds' memories will be relatively inaccurate if they're recalling something, asked to recall something that was inconsistent with their gender schemas, in part because when they're asked to recall something that's inconsistent with their gender schemas, they distort their experiences so that their memories are consistent with the schemas, even if the memories are incorrect. Okay, so I think that'll do it for this lecture on gender. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture. I hope you've learned a thing or two about gender role development and various aspects of gender role development, including gender constancy and sex type behaviors. I've enjoyed lecturing to you, and I will see you next time for the next lecture. Take care now.